All right, good afternoon. I am Saad Al-Aziz, the owner and head instructor of Semper Fortis Jiu Jitsu here in San Antonio, Texas, and looking to answer the question of the week this week. So this week's question, one of my students asked, what were the top 5 Brazilian Jiu Jitsu books that I would recommend for his reading collection? And it was a great question because there's a lot of books out there on Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, and it's in a couple different categories. Most of the books are showing techniques, Brazilian Jiu Jitsu techniques that you can use and add to your repertoire of moves. And then some of the books are history and culture of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. So I'm in my top 5. I have both included, and then I'm going to put an honorary mention in only because I haven't read the book yet. So there'll be a 6th book that I'm going to recommend, but I haven't read that particular book. So when it comes to the history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and there's always going to be disagreements on history because the very nature of history, it's just 2 words. It's his story. And most history just isn't very accurate. Not just of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but of anything. Like one of the big complaints people have about Japanese history writers is when you read Japanese history books for their schools in Japan, they just sort of gloss over World War II. Say very little about it. So that's the way it goes. It's like history has a nature, just by nature has a tendency to be inaccurate. Recently, I was trying to look up the history of the Celtic people, and the major historian, most reports were written by Julius Caesar, who was at war with them. And it's like, wow, because unfortunately the Celtic people didn't leave a lot of history, written history. So almost everything that we know about them was written by Julius Caesar, the guy that ultimately led to the destruction of the Celtic Empire. Some people even call it a Celtic Holocaust, as in regards to what Julius Caesar and the Romans did to the Celtic people. So that's the challenge with history, is like getting accurate history, reliable history, but by the very nature of history, it's his story. And people write the story and they include things that they feel are more important to them, and exclude things that maybe don't support the narrative that they wanted to push out. So just keep all that in mind anytime you're reading a history book. So my favorite book right now for Jiu-Jitsu history is The Gracie Way. This was written by Kid Peligro. On the cover you can see Royler Gracie. I believe this was before his fight with Sakuraba. Yeah. And then you can see Salo Ribeiro here. You can see Hickson. A lot of the legendary Jiu-Jitsu fighters are all in this entourage with Royler. And I think the picture was after the fight. But either way, that's what's on the front of the book. And this was written by Kid Peligro, who happens to be a Royler Gracie black belt. What I like about the book is he covers some of the main figures in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu history. Not everybody is covered in here, and people can debate whether someone should have been included and maybe somebody got left out. But I feel like he did a really good job, and he just breaks it down by chapters. Like chapter 1 is on Carlos Gracie. Chapter 2, Helio Gracie. Chapter 3, Carlson Gracie. Chapter 4, Holes Gracie. Chapter 5, Horian Gracie. Chapter 6, Carlos Gracie Jr. Chapter 7, Hickson Gracie. Chapter 8, Royler Gracie. Chapter 9, Hoist Gracie. And Chapter 10, Henzo. And then he talks about each individual. He dedicates a chapter to each one of these pioneers of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and talks about some of their accomplishments and some of their innovations. And it's a very well written book. I really enjoyed reading it. And I learned a lot about some of these major players. You know, I wish he would have talked maybe more about Jigoro Kano, the founder of judo, because judo had a huge impact on Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I wish he would have talked about Count Maeda, you know, because Count Maeda is the one that directly taught Carlos Gracie. And from Maeda, you know, sort of the spawn of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because he was in Brazil teaching Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So I wish there was more, you know, said about, you know, Count Maeda. And he talks a little bit about him, but not, I would have liked to have learned more. Also, Vladimir and Valdo Santana, who were two amazing fighters. And they were initially Helio Gracie's students, and then they became adversaries. And that led to some legendary fights between Helio Gracie and Vladimir Santana, also between Hobson Gracie and Valdo Santana, also Carlson Gracie Sr. against Vladimir Santana, and even Kimura fought Vladimir Santana. And last time I was in Brazil, I went to the Santana Academy, and both Vladimir Santana and Valdo are passed away now, but Valdo's son is the head instructor there. And what I thought was really unique was at the Santana Academy, they're not teaching Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. They are now teaching judo. Judo is what, you know, they're a judo school and not a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school, which I thought was fascinating, because both Vladimir and Valdo were definitely experts in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. They were phenomenal fighters, and but there's not a lot known about, you know, their history, and I wish more writers would talk about them. Also about Masahiko Kimura. I might be mispronouncing his first name, but Kimura was a fighter. He was an amazing judoka, and he was the one that fought Helio Gracie, and it was a fight that in where Kimura used the Kimura against Helio. I don't know what they called the Kimura before then, but afterwards the Brazilians started calling the technique of this shoulder lock technique as a Kimura, and you know, during that fight he broke Helio's arm with the Kimura. Also, I wish there would be more history written on men like Oswaldo Fata. And in my previous video where I talked about the difference, or if there was a difference between Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Gracie Jiu Jitsu, I talked about that maybe 2 weeks ago. One of the reasons we call it Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is because in Oswaldo Fata's lineage, there is no Gracie. And the reason for that is when Maeda left Rio de Janeiro and moved to Sao Paulo, he ended up with new students, and he continued to teach. And Oswaldo Fata was one of these students. And from Oswaldo Fata, you ended up with teams like GFT and Nova Yanao. I'm drawing a blank on some more teams, but there was the reason it's not just called Gracie Jiu Jitsu is because there was more people than just the Gracies that innovated and helped create what is Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. Although the Gracies were the main influencers in the worldwide spread, but just know that they weren't the only ones. But there hasn't been a lot written on, you know, people like Oswaldo Fata. So that, if you want to learn history, the Gracie Way, highly recommend that book. It's a wonderful book, and you can learn a lot from it. On techniques, if you want to learn about techniques, the absolutely best book I've ever read that gives an instructional on Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques is JiuJitsu University by Saulo Ribeiro, which, as I pointed out, Saulo is on the cover of Gracie Way. Now, I want to put a disclaimer because I did receive my purple belt from Saulo Ribeiro. So I could say I'm maybe a little bit biased. So back to history. But this book, I really love the way Saulo breaks down a person's jiu-jitsu journey. And he shows various techniques throughout the book, a lot of colored photos. But the way he breaks it down, which I thought was really innovative, is he says, man, at white belt, your whole focus should be learning how to survive an encounter. And then he says at blue belt, your whole focus should be learning how to escape bad situations. And he said, man, at purple belt, your whole focus should be learning how to get more dominant positions. And then at brown belt, your whole focus should be on passing the guard. And then he said black belt is when your whole focus should be tuning in to, submissions. Not that he's not teaching submissions at white belt level. He's just saying at white belt, your job is to survive. And one of the things I enjoyed about Saulo's philosophy is that, it's just like when I teach in here at Semper Fortis Jiu-Jitsu, if I show a student 10 techniques that are all submissions, and then I show them 10 techniques which are all defensive escapes, and they roll for the first time, they will have an opportunity to use all 10 escapes. Whether they remember them or not is another issue, but they'll have an opportunity because they'll be in bad positions. However, they may not have an opportunity to use any of the 10 submissions that I showed them because they were never in the positions to get them. And, they'll have to develop on their jiu-jitsu journey, to start to get into positions where they can execute submissions. So learning the defense is much more important. And learning how to survive is much more important than learning a bunch of submissions, especially early in your jiu-jitsu journey. So JiuJitsu University by Saulo Ribeiro, phenomenal book, and hands down the best book on the market, in my opinion. And like I said, I am biased because Saulo awarded me my purple belt. He's an amazing competitor and an amazing teacher. So I want to put that out there before somebody points out, oh, didn't you get your purple from Saulo? Yes, I did. But I still love his book. So there is some bias there. Another book that I think is a classic, we actually have it in a box. It's Gracie Jiu Jitsu, and it's written by Elio Gracie. And this is, when you have an opportunity to get a book written by one of the, the pioneers of jiu-jitsu, that's a book you should check out. It's got a lot of great pictures of Elio, and he's doing all these techniques on his son Horian, and shows a lot of different techniques. Talks a little bit about jiu-jitsu history, but most of it is just showing techniques. And then on the back of the book, he talks a lot about the Gracie diet, which is a diet that Carlos Gracie Sr. developed, and it's a way many of the Gracie family members and a lot of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioners practice this diet called the Gracie diet, and they believe that it's good for your health, good for your jiu-jitsu, good for longevity, and it talks about all that in this book. So highly recommend this particular book, the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, and written by Elio Gracie himself. Another book really good on techniques is written by Francisco Mansour, The Bible of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Francisco Mansour was one of the few people that ever received a direct black belt promotion from Elio Gracie himself. So most people that you meet are black belts under one of Elio's sons, where Francisco Mansour was a black belt under Elio himself. And Francisco writes this book. Francisco Mansour is now a red belt, a grand master in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And I had the opportunity to train with Francisco probably about 7-8 years ago. And what I loved about him, and of course we got him to autograph the book, is what I loved about his philosophy is he said, man, I don't do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He said, I don't do Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. I do Elio Gracie Jiu-Jitsu because he was my teacher and he was my only teacher, and that's what I do. I do Elio Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. And he was incredibly loyal to his teacher. He had some amazing stories. Like one of his stories was the Gracies originally didn't have a belt system, the colored belt system that we now have. There wasn't black belts in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu until, I'm going to get the year wrong, but it's like maybe 1967, 68. Up until then, they had dark blue belts for the instructors, and the students had white belts. So if you was an instructor, you had a dark blue, everybody else would have a white belt. That's why you would see photos of Helio Gracie later in life. Although he was already a red belt, he would tie a dark blue belt on his waist. And people would be like, oh, you're going back to blue? And it was a tradition, and that's what, through a large part of the jiu-jitsu journey, from say 1925 when they opened the original Gracie Academy till, and I'm gonna get it's either 67, 67 or 68, 66, 67 or 68, where they came in with the belt system that now is, white belt, blue belt, purple belt, brown belt, black belt, on up, and then, ultimately a red belt. But that didn't come in until 67, well, towards 66, 67, 68. One of those years is right. I wish I was more accurate. I should have researched it. But Mansour, being one of Helio's students, really good competitor, really good fighter, and they asked, Helio had promoted some other people to black belt, but he didn't promote Mansour yet. And then somebody else asked Helio, hey, Mansour is really good. Like, you haven't promoted him to black belt yet. And Helio Gracie said, I'm not promoting him because he doesn't follow the Gracie diet. He drinks coffee. Now, here in America, most students would have long left that instructor. They'd been like, oh, I'm leaving. Mansour said, after that day that I learned that that's what was holding me back in my master's eyes, he said, I never drank another sip of coffee again, including to this day. And Mansour is probably in his 80s, probably close to 90 now. He gave up coffee totally, which I think is amazing, because I wouldn't have got a black belt because I love coffee, and I don't know if I could give up. No, I couldn't give up coffee for jiu-jitsu. Maybe, we'll see. But fortunately, I don't have to make that decision. So, great book, Francisco Mansour. He calls it the Bible of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He shows a lot of different techniques, really good color photos, a lot of different techniques. And it's techniques that you can do. Like, it's nothing fancy, nothing exotic. It's just really tried and true Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques, and he explains it really well. So I like that book a lot. The last one I will include is Marcelo Garcia. He writes his book, and what I liked about it is he called it Advanced Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So, he's giving you a heads up, like, this isn't, for novices. This is a little bit more advanced stuff. But Marcelo Garcia, for those that aren't familiar with him, is arguably, and of course everything is a matter of opinion, but arguably, maybe pound for pound, the greatest Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu competitor, at least of my lifetime. An amazing competitor, not a very big guy, a smaller guy, but just amazing, and a very smooth jiu-jitsu style. It was always a pleasure watching Marcelo compete. And now he doesn't compete now. Now his students do really well in competitions. But just an amazing competitor, an amazing teacher. And he does a good job on his book. He's got some pictures, a lot of writing. But I think it's a very good book. It's a worthwhile investment. And he explains a lot of his jiu-jitsu philosophy and many of the techniques that he enjoys using. And so I would recommend that as a book on techniques. So I've given you so the Mansour book, mostly techniques. The Gracie Jiu Jitsu book by Helio, mostly technique with a little bit of history. Mansour also includes some history in his book, and Marcelo's book, mostly techniques with a little bit of philosophy. The Gracie Way book by Kid Peligro is history. He's talking about history and the champions and the pioneers of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And but like I said, the Saulo Ribeiro Jiu-Jitsu University book is a book on techniques. lot of techniques and philosophy. Great book. But the challenge is with any history book is that there's going to be people left out, and whether they're left out just due to biases or maybe just an honest appraisal that maybe this person wasn't as significant a contributor as another person. And it's all philosophy. It's almost like I said, it's similar to me saying I think Marcelo Garcia was pound for pound greatest jiu-jitsu competitor of my lifetime that I've ever seen. Somebody else would argue, oh no, it's Roger Gracie. Somebody else might argue that it's Bruno Malfacini. An argument can be made for Caltera. There's a lot of arguments that could be made. So that's the challenge with history. Is it's like it's going to come down to a person's opinion, which very similar to like the two photos on my wall. Like I have Carlos Gracie on my wall and I have Helio Gracie on my wall. If you travel to the different Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu academies, it's not that common to see both of them on a school's wall. Have a tendency, if you go to one of somebody in Carlos Gracie Sr.'s lineage, you will own, especially his sons and daughters' lineage, you would just see Carlos Gracie Sr. on the wall. There will not be a photo of Helio Gracie. And if you go to Helio Gracie's sons in their lineage, you'll just see Helio Gracie on the wall. You won't see a photo of Carlos Gracie Sr. And I think both of them should be on the wall because both of them made amazing contributions, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is where it's at because of the driving force that these two men were. And if I had a painting of Count Maeda, I'd put him on the wall too because I think he should be on the wall. But there's not a lot known about what happened to him. Nobody's doing paintings of him apparently. So there's a lot of people that could be on the wall, but these two guys should definitely be on the wall. And so that's why they're on the wall at my academy. And the challenge when people talk about jiu-jitsu history is, like people have a tendency to favor one or the other or exclude somebody. And so what I'm excited about, and like I said earlier, like I think when we talk about jiu-jitsu history, there should be conversations about Jigoro Kano, about Count Maeda, about, Kimura, about Oswaldo Fada. Like, I wish a lot more was talked about Oswaldo Fada because he had a huge impact on the influence of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. About Vladimir and Valdo Santana, because to become a great champion, you have to have a great adversary. And Helio Gracie and Hobson Gracie and Carlson Gracie, they had to fight the Santana brothers. And they were great adversaries. But very little is known about the Santana brothers. So what I'm excited about is, and the reason I haven't included this book in my top 5. So I gave you my top 5. Because I had to count up 5 again because I'll end up missing one and somebody will be like, hey, you missed one. But I did give you 5. But a 6th book that I'm looking forward to getting is written by Robert Drysdale, who, if you've ever met Robert Drysdale or listened to him talk, he's not only is he an amazing jiu-jitsu black belt and competitor, but he's a very intellectual, well-educated man. And he took on a history project, and he's called his book that's just recently released called Opening the Closed Guard, and it's the origins of jiu-jitsu in Brazil. So he's tackling this history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu from a different perspective, and I think from more of an academic perspective. And I'm really excited about reading this book. It's not in my top 5 right now because I haven't read it yet. So it's not on my list. So my student asked for the top 5 most recommended books. So it's not on that list yet because I haven't read it yet. But because I know the author, I know of the author's accomplishments and of his other academic work, I'm pretty sure this is going to be a great book, and I'm really excited about reading it. And I've got it on order. I think it's going to be great. So I may have to do an update on this video in a few months after I read the book to say, hey, this book needs to be in your top 5. So it's called Opening the Closed Guard, Robert Drysdale. So I'm looking forward to that work to see, like if he gives us a more in-depth or better picture of the development of Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil. And so I'm excited about that. So that was the answer to this week's question. Those are my 5 books. And got a question for next week? Post it in the comments, or when you see me in school, just say, hey, how about this? And I'll try to tackle that question. Yeah, that's it. So, hey, see y'all next week. See you in class. All right, be good. Ciao.